There was once a prophecy, so absolute, so terrible, that a father tried to kill his own newborn son to stop it from coming true. And in trying to escape it, he sealed it. There was a son who, on hearing that same prophecy spoken over his own life, fled from the two people he believed to be his mother and father, running as far and as fast as he could, and in running, walked directly into the arms of his fate. This is the strange and merciless logic of the oldest stories the Greeks ever told about prophecy, that the harder you run from what is written, the faster you arrive at it. That the very choices we make to escape our fate are so often the choices that fulfill it. Tonight, we are going to follow one man's life from its first hour to its most devastating discovery, and ask the question that has haunted every generation since: is a fate written before we are born a fate we could ever have escaped? Or is the running itself already part of the story? To understand, we must go back to a golden city in the hills of Greece, and to a king who received a warning from the god of prophecy himself. A warning he should never have tried to outrun. The city was Thebes, one of the oldest and proudest cities in all of Greece, founded generations before by a hero named Cadmus, who had sown a field with the teeth of a slain dragon and watched armed warriors spring up from the furrows. A city, even in its founding myth, born from violence and blood, sown deliberately into the earth. It is worth pausing on that old founding story for a moment, because it tells us something of the soil this whole tragedy would later grow from. Cadmus had come to that place a wanderer, searching for a lost sister, and when he needed water, he sent his companions to a nearby spring, not knowing it was guarded by a fierce serpent sacred to the god of war. The serpent killed them all, and Cadmus, in grief and fury, killed the serpent in turn, only to be told by the goddess Athena that he must now sow its teeth into the earth like seeds. From those teeth sprang a host of armed warriors, who immediately turned on one another in a senseless slaughter, until only 5 remained, and those 5 became the ancestors of the noblest families of Thebes. From its very first hour, in other words, Thebes was a city built upon a debt to the gods that was never quite settled, a city where violence answered violence, and where the sins of the founders had a long and patient habit of resurfacing generations later in the blood of their descendants. By the time our story begins, Thebes was ruled by a king named Laius, a descendant of that same dragon-born line, and his queen, Jocasta. For years, the royal couple had longed for a child, and for years none had come. And so at last, Laius traveled to the oracle at Delphi, to the priestess who spoke the words of the god Apollo, to ask when an heir might finally be granted to his house. The answer he received was not the blessing he had hoped for. It was a curse dressed as a prophecy. The oracle told him plainly, "If a son is ever born to you, that son is fated to kill you, and take your throne and your wife for his own." It is worth imagining for a moment what that long journey home must have been like for Laius, riding back across the hills toward his own city, carrying inside him a truth no father should ever have to carry, that the child he might one day hold in his arms was already, in the eyes of the god, his own executioner. Some of the old tellings say that Laius had, in fact, wronged the gods once before, in an act of cruelty toward a young prince he had once been entrusted to protect, and that the prophecy at Delphi was not a random cruelty of fate, but a punishment owed for that old debt, one more thread in the long habit this city had, since the days of the dragon's teeth, of paying for old sins with new suffering. Whether that older crime was the true cause or not, Laius returned to Thebes with that warning locked inside him like a splinter of ice. and for a time it seemed the prophecy might simply never come due, for still no child was born. But at last, whether through carelessness or wine or the simple persistence of hope, a son was conceived, and Jocasta gave birth to a boy. And here, at the very first breath of this story, Laius made the choice that would set every terrible thing in motion, rather than raise the boy as his own and watch him always with fear, rather than simply trust that a king might be strong enough to face whatever fate held in store. Laius decided that the only way to defeat the prophecy was to make certain the child never lived long enough to fulfill it. He took the infant from his mother's arms. And here we should pause, because this is the same cruelty, the same cold and terrible logic that runs like a thread through so many of the old Greek stories. This same fear of a child's future undoing a father's throne. Laius bound the baby's ankles together with a metal pin, piercing them through, and gave the child to a trusted shepherd with a single order: carry this boy up into the wild slopes of Mount Cithaeron and leave him there to die, exposed to the cold and the wolves, so that no drop of royal blood would ever be found on him, and no one could ever say the king had murdered his own son with his own hand. It is a peculiar kind of cowardice, and one the old Greek storytellers understood with unflinching clarity. The belief that guilt can be diluted by distance, that a crime committed by another's hand, at another's place, somehow leaves the one who ordered it clean. Laius did not lift a blade against his son. He simply arranged, carefully and at a comfortable remove, for the mountain and the cold and the wild animals to do what his own conscience could not bear to do directly. It is the same fragile self-deception that runs through so much of human cruelty across every age, the desperate, hollow comfort of not having to watch. It was, in its way, a coward's murder, one step removed from the deed itself, so that a father's conscience might stay just barely clean. But the shepherd, standing on that lonely mountainside with a crying infant in his arms, could not do it. Whether from pity or simple human weakness in the face of a child's helpless cries, he did not leave the boy to die. Instead, he carried him down the far side of the mountain, into the neighboring kingdom of Corinth, and there he handed the child to another shepherd, a servant of the childless king of that land. And so the infant, who was meant to die on a mountainside, was carried instead into the palace of King Polybus and Queen Merope of Corinth, who had long wanted a child of their own, and who took the boy in and raised him as their true-born son and heir, never once revealing where he had truly come from. They gave him a name that would, in the bitterest of ironies, describe the very wound his own father had inflicted upon him, for his ankles, still swollen and scarred from the metal pin, gave him the name Oedipus, which means, in the old Greek, swollen foot. Every day of his life, without knowing it, he would carry the mark of the father who had tried to kill him. It is a small, quiet cruelty of this story, easy to pass over, but worth sitting with, that a name, chosen in innocence by loving foster parents who thought only to describe the scars an abandoned infant had arrived with, could carry inside it the whole hidden history of a crime no one in that new household would ever suspect. He would hear his own name spoken with affection 1,000 times in his childhood, by nurses, by playmates, by the king and queen who loved him as their own, and not once would he understand that it was in truth a confession written on his own body by a father who had wished him dead. Oedipus grew up believing, with his whole heart, that he was the true prince of Corinth, the beloved son of Polybus and Merope. He wanted for nothing. He was raised in comfort, trained as a prince, and loved as any true son might be loved. He grew tall and quick-witted and admired, trained in the arts of a prince, in wrestling and horsemanship, in the management of a great household, in the patient art of listening to petitioners and weighing their disputes fairly. For even as a young man, he showed the same sharp, restless intelligence that would one day let him see through the riddle of a monster no other man in Greece could answer. And it might have stayed that way forever, a lie kept gently and completely, had a single careless remark not been made at a banquet one evening when Oedipus was a grown young man. A guest, perhaps drunk, perhaps simply cruel, muttered that Oedipus was not truly the king's own son at all, that he had been adopted, brought from elsewhere, and did not carry the royal blood he believed was his. Oedipus, stung and unsettled, went to his parents and asked them directly. And Polybus and Merope, whether from love or from shame, denied it utterly, and comforted him, and told him to pay no attention to a drunken insult. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it would not stop growing. And so, the way any troubled soul in ancient Greece might do, Oedipus decided to go to the one place that could tell him the truth beyond all doubt. He traveled to Delphi, to the very same oracle that had once spoken its dark words to Laius, to ask the god Apollo who he truly was. What the oracle told him was not an answer to his question at all. It offered him no name, no lineage, no explanation of his birth. Instead, the priestess spoke a prophecy of her own, as terrible as the one that had once been given to Laius. And perhaps, in truth, it was the very same prophecy, following the same doomed bloodline. "You are fated," she said, "to kill your own father, and to marry your own mother. And from that marriage, children of a cursed and tainted line will be born." Oedipus fled that temple in horror. He did not doubt for one single moment that Polybus and Merope, the only parents he had ever known, were his true father and mother. And so, believing with his whole heart that he was protecting the two people he loved most in the world, Oedipus made a decision of extraordinary and tragic courage. He would never return to Corinth. He would never again lay eyes on the man and woman he called father and mother, so that the prophecy could never, ever come true through his own hand. He turned his back on the only home he had ever known and set out on the road alone, choosing exile over the crime the god had foretold. It was the noblest choice he could have made. Consider what it truly asked of him to walk away in a single afternoon from every comfort he had ever known, from the only mother and father he had ever loved, from a throne that would one day have been his, and to do it not out of anger or ambition, but purely out of love. To protect two people from a horror he believed only he could prevent. There is no cowardice anywhere in that decision. It is, in fact, one of the most selfless choices any figure in all of Greek myth ever makes. And that is precisely what makes what follows so unbearable to watch. It was about to walk him, step by step, directly into the very fate he was trying so desperately to escape. For Oedipus did not know, could never have known, that the road he had chosen fleeing Corinth led not away from his true father, but straight toward him. He did not know that Corinth was not his birthplace at all, and that the true king he was fated to kill was not the gentle Polybus he had left behind, but a stranger named Laius, the king of Thebes, a city he had never once visited in his life. Every step he took to save Polybus was a step taken in complete ignorance of who Polybus actually was to him. And every step brought him closer to the man whose blood truly ran in his own veins. The road from Delphi wound through a narrow place where three separate roads met, a crossroads in the wild hill country, walled in by steep rock on either side, so narrow that two chariots could barely pass one another. And it was there, on that same afternoon, that Oedipus, walking on foot, found his path blocked by a chariot coming the other way, carrying an older man, a herald, and a small company of attendants. It was, though Oedipus could not have known it, the very king he had unknowingly set out to avoid, Laius himself, traveling from Thebes toward Delphi on some errand of his own. Neither man knew the other. Neither man could see, in the stranger blocking his path, the family that bound them together by blood. What happened next has been told and retold for 3,000 years, and every telling agrees on this much. It began with nothing more than the ordinary arrogance of the road. The herald leading Laius's chariot ordered the young stranger to step aside and make way for a king. Oedipus, proud and travel-worn, and unwilling to be shoved from his path by strangers, refused to yield. Words turned to shoving, and the herald or the old man himself struck at Oedipus with a goad, the same kind of pointed staff used to drive horses, and Oedipus, seized by a fury he could not fully explain even to himself, struck back. In the narrow space of that crossroads, in a burst of violence that lasted only moments, Oedipus killed the old man in the chariot, along with all but one of his attendants, who fled and would later carry the news back to Thebes. And then Oedipus walked on, shaken perhaps by his own temper, but with no idea at all of the crime he had just committed. He did not know he had killed a king. He did not know he had killed his own father. Even the surviving attendant who fled that crossroads and carried the news back to Thebes did not tell the full truth of what had happened, whether from shame at having run or confusion in the chaos of the fight. He reported to the grieving city that Laius had been killed not by one man alone, but by a whole band of robbers, a small mercy of a lie that meant no one in Thebes ever thought to search for a single traveling stranger. The truth lay buried at that crossroads for years, hidden inside a story that had itself been quietly, unknowingly rewritten. The first half of the prophecy had come true at a nameless crossroads between two men who were strangers to one another in everything except blood. Oedipus continued on his road, and it carried him at last to the gates of the great city of Thebes, a city he entered as a wandering stranger, with no idea that it was, in the truest sense, his own ancestral home. But he found that city gripped by terror, for crouched upon a high rock just outside the gates was a monster, a creature, with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the head and breast of a woman called the Sphinx. She had been sent, some said, as a plague upon the city, and she demanded a toll of Thebes that no army could pay. Every traveler who tried to pass her rock, she stopped and posed to them a single riddle. And any who could not answer it correctly, she seized in her claws and devoured whole. Already the noblest young men of Thebes, sent out one by one to try their wit against her, had failed and been killed, and the city, now leaderless in the wake of its king's mysterious death upon the road, was drowning in grief and fear in equal measure. The riddle the Sphinx posed to every traveler was this: what walks on 4 legs in the morning, on 2 legs at noon, and on 3 legs in the evening? No one who had faced her had yet solved it, and their failure had cost them their lives. But when Oedipus came to that rock, and the Sphinx posed her riddle to him, as she had to all the rest, he did not hesitate long. The answer, he said, is man. For as an infant, a human crawls, in the strength of adulthood he walks upright on 2 legs, and in old age he leans upon a staff, a 3rd leg, to carry him through his final years. It was the whole span of a human life, folded into a single riddle, And Oedipus, the man who did not yet know his own true beginning, was the one who finally named the shape of every human life from cradle to grave. Devastated at having been outwitted, at last the Sphinx, in some tellings, threw herself from her high rock to her death. There is something worth noticing in the shape of that answer, something Oedipus himself, in his triumph, never paused to consider. The riddle asked him to name the single creature that changes its very form across the span of one life, weak at the beginning, strong in the middle, weak again at the end. And the answer he gave, with such easy confidence, was, in the end, a description of a journey he was living through himself, without once recognizing his own reflection in it. He had solved the mystery of every human life on earth, and remained utterly blind to the mystery of his own, and the terror over Thebes lifted in an instant. And so a grateful and grieving city, desperate for a savior after the loss of its king, offered this clever stranger both its crown and the hand of its new widowed queen, a woman named Jocasta. And so it was that Oedipus, without ever raising his sword against the crime he thought he had fled, without ever laying eyes on Corinth again, became king of Thebes and married Jocasta, and in doing so fulfilled the second half of the very prophecy he had crossed a country to escape. He had run from a false father to avoid killing him, and killed his true father on a lonely road instead. He had refused ever to see his true mother again in Corinth, not knowing his true mother lived in Thebes, and there he married her, believing her simply a grateful queen bestowing her hand upon the hero who had saved her city. Neither Oedipus nor Jocasta had the slightest notion of what they had truly become to one another. For years, by every account, they lived not in horror, but in genuine happiness, ruling Thebes together with wisdom and care, and 4 children were born to them in that palace: 2 sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and 2 daughters, Antigone and Ismene, children who were, in the terrible arithmetic of this story, both the offspring and the half-siblings of their own mother, though not one soul in that court yet understood the truth of it. By every account that has come down to us, these were not years of quiet dread or lingering suspicion. They were years of real and unguarded happiness. Oedipus ruled with the same sharp intelligence that had unraveled the Sphinx's riddle, settling disputes fairly, defending the city's borders, listening to his people with a patience that made him beloved rather than merely feared. Jocasta, for her part, seemed to find in this second marriage a peace she had perhaps never fully known in her first, and the palace that had once mourned a murdered king now rang, by all report, with the ordinary warmth of a family. Children learning their letters, a father teaching his sons to ride, a mother watching her daughters grow. It is important to sit with that happiness for a moment, and not rush past it toward the horror waiting on the other side of it, because it is precisely that genuine, unknowing happiness that makes the unraveling to come so much harder to bear. This was never a house built consciously upon sin. It was a house built, brick by brick, upon an innocence that could not last. For years, the city prospered under their rule, and the whole horror of Laius's death and the riddle of the crossroads faded into old rumor, a mystery never solved and slowly forgotten. But there is an old and unyielding law that runs through every Greek story of this kind. A crime against the natural order does not simply fade away because it goes unpunished. It waits, and eventually it always finds a way to surface. And so, many years into the peaceful reign of Oedipus and Jocasta, a new terror fell upon Thebes, not a monster this time, but a plague. Crops withered in the fields. Cattle sickened and died in their pens. Women laboring to give birth lost their children before they ever drew breath, and a wasting sickness moved through the city like a slow and merciless fire, taking the old and the young alike. The people of Thebes, remembering that this same king had once freed them from the Sphinx, turned to Oedipus once more, certain that their wise and beloved ruler could save them a second time. Oedipus, as any good king would, sent his brother-in-law, Creon, to Delphi to ask the oracle what was causing the suffering of the city, and how it might be lifted. And the answer that came back was the second thread of this fate, beginning, at last, to pull tight. The plague, the oracle said, was a punishment sent by the gods, because the murderer of the former king, Laius, still walked free within the borders of Thebes, his crime unpunished and unavenged. Until that murderer was found and driven from the city, or made to pay for his crime, the suffering of Thebes would never end. And so Oedipus, with all the fierce determination and pride that had once solved the riddle of the Sphinx, swore before his whole city that he would hunt down this murderer himself and bring him to justice, whoever he might be. He stood before the gathered people of Thebes, in the same square where he had once been hailed as their savior, and swore a solemn and public oath to hunt the murderer down with all the force of the law, calling down curses upon that unknown killer, that he be driven from every hearth and home in the land, denied shelter, denied friendship, denied even the comfort of a single kind word from any citizen of Thebes, forced to wander in wretched exile until the day he died. He spoke those curses with his whole heart, believing himself to be speaking them against some hidden stranger. He did not know, in the cruelest irony the old poets ever wrote, that he was pronouncing sentence upon himself, in his own voice, before his own people, with a thoroughness no other accuser could ever have matched. Oedipus began his investigation exactly as any determined king would, calling upon every source of wisdom the city possessed. He summoned the blind prophet Tiresias, an old seer famous throughout Greece for his true and unerring visions, and commanded him to reveal what he knew of the old king's death. But Tiresias, standing before the throne, with his sightless eyes fixed on nothing, refused to speak. He begged Oedipus, again and again, to let the matter rest, to release him from having to answer, telling him plainly that some knowledge is a terrible gift, and that it would be better for both of them if the truth stayed buried. It is one of the most haunting scenes in all the old Greek stories. A blind man who can see everything, pleading with a seeing king who can see nothing at all, to please stop demanding the one truth that will destroy him. But Oedipus, proud and furious at being denied, and utterly certain of his own innocence, would not let the old man go. He accused Tiresias of conspiring against him, of plotting with his own brother-in-law Creon to seize the throne, of hiding the truth out of treachery rather than mercy. And so, wounded and provoked beyond his patience, the old prophet at last spoke the words he had tried so hard to spare him. "You yourself," Tiresias told him, "are the murderer you are hunting. You are the plague upon this city. And you live, though you do not know it, in a marriage that the gods themselves recoil from." Oedipus heard these words and understood nothing of them at all, except that they were an insult too monstrous to be borne. He dismissed the old man as a bitter, jealous fraud, and continued his investigation, utterly unaware that the answer had just been placed directly into his hands, and that he had thrown it away in anger. There is a bitter symmetry worth pausing on here, one the old tragedians clearly intended. A blind man had just offered a seeing king perfect clarity, and the king, trusting only his own eyes, had called it darkness. Sight and blindness would circle one another like this, again and again before the story was finished, until at last the two men would trade places entirely. It was Jocasta who, without meaning to, began to loosen the final threads of the mystery. Trying to comfort her husband and to prove to him that the prophecies of oracles could not always be trusted, she told him, almost carelessly, the story of an old prophecy given to her first husband, Laius, that he was fated to be killed by his own son. And to prove how false such warnings could be, she told Oedipus that their son had instead been exposed on a mountainside as an infant, and had certainly died there long ago, while Laius himself, she said, had been killed by bandits at a crossroads, by strangers, not by any child of his own. She meant these words as a comfort. Instead, in the mind of Oedipus, something cold and terrible began, for the first time, to stir. A crossroads. A group of travelers. A confrontation with an old man in a chariot on the very road from Delphi, in the very years she was describing. He said nothing yet of his growing dread, but he asked her, with a strange urgency, for every detail she could remember of the old king's appearance, and of that final journey. How many men had ridden with him? What he had worn? How old he had been, and how he had carried himself? Jocasta answered each question freely, seeing no danger in any of it, still believing she was simply laying an old ghost to rest for her troubled husband's sake, never once suspecting that every answer she gave was another stone being fitted, with terrible precision, into a wall that was closing in around them both. The truth, once it began to surface, came from two directions at once, converging on Oedipus like the very roads that had once met at that fateful crossroads. First, a messenger arrived from Corinth, bringing news that was meant, in its own way, to be joyful, that King Polybus, the man Oedipus still believed to be his true father, had died of old age, peacefully, in his own bed. For one brief and terrible moment, Oedipus felt something like relief, for it seemed the first half of his old prophecy could never now come true. He could never kill a father who was already dead of natural causes. But the messenger, wanting to fully ease the new king's mind, then revealed something he thought would comfort Oedipus completely, that Polybus had never truly been his father at all, and that the messenger himself, years before, as a young shepherd, had received the infant Oedipus from another shepherd's hands upon the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, and carried him to Corinth as a gift for the childless king. The ground, in that instant, opened beneath everything Oedipus had ever believed about himself. Jocasta, listening to this exchange, understood before Oedipus did. She understood it completely, and all at once, and she begged him, with a desperation that must have been almost impossible to disguise, to stop his investigation, to ask no more questions, to let the whole matter rest forever. But Oedipus, the same man whose fierce, unbending will had once solved an unsolvable riddle to save this very city, could not now stop pulling at the single thread that was unraveling his entire life. He believed, in his pride, that Jocasta feared only some scandal of low birth, some shame that he might turn out to be no true prince at all, but merely a foundling of common blood. He had no idea that she already understood the full and unbearable truth. And so he pressed on, sending for the one man who could finally close the circle entirely, the old shepherd who had carried the infant up the mountain so many years before, and who, in one of the story's last cruel twists, turned out to be the very same servant who had once served in the house of Laius, now living out his old age in quiet retirement in the Theban countryside. Brought before the king and questioned directly, the old shepherd at first refused to answer, just as Tiresias had refused. Understanding with the plain instinct of a man who had carried this secret for decades, exactly what confirming the truth would unleash. But Oedipus, driven now by something beyond his own control, threatened him until the old man broke, and at last spoke the words that ended everything. Yes, he said, the infant he had carried up the mountain and could not bring himself to kill, and had given instead to a Corinthian shepherd out of pity, was the very son of Laius and Jocasta. And the stranger standing before him now, the great king of Thebes who had solved the Sphinx's riddle and saved the city, was that same infant, grown to manhood. Every piece was now in place. The man who had killed Laius at the crossroads was his own son. The woman who shared his bed and had borne him 4 children was his own mother. Every choice Oedipus had ever made to outrun this fate, leaving Corinth, refusing to return, striking down a stranger in fury, on a lonely road, had been, without his knowing it, the very steps of the path that led him here. He stood in the middle of his own throne room, surrounded by the life he had built with such pride, and watched every single piece of it reveal itself as something entirely other than what he had believed. The wife beside him, the children who called him father, the very city that had once crowned him for his cleverness. Nothing had changed in that room in the last hour except what he now understood. And yet everything in it had become, in an instant, a different thing entirely than it had been only a moment before. Jocasta could not bear to remain in that palace one moment longer, once the last piece of the truth had been spoken aloud, while Oedipus still stood reeling, demanding to know more, to understand more, to somehow find a door out of the horror that had closed around him. Jocasta went alone into the private chambers of the palace, and there, in her grief and her shame, she took her own life, unable to live any longer as both wife and mother to the same man, unable to face her children, or her city, or herself, with the truth now fully known. And when Oedipus at last broke into that chamber and found her hanging where she had taken her own life, something in him broke as completely and as finally as she had. He could not undo what he had done. He could not unknow what he now knew. But in his anguish he found one single act that felt, to him, like the only justice left available to a man who had spent his whole life seeing so clearly and understanding so little. He took the golden pins from her gown, the very brooches that had fastened her royal robes, and with his own hands he drove them into his own eyes, blinding himself utterly, so that he who had failed for so long to see the truth in front of him would never again have to look upon a world he had ruined with his own unseeing eyes. It was not, in the end, an act of madness, whatever it might first appear to be. It was the last clear-headed judgment of a man who had spent his whole life prizing his own sharp sight above all things, choosing in the one moment that mattered more than any riddle, to punish the very eyes that had seen so much and understood so little. It is here, in this single devastating image, a king who once answered the riddle of the Sphinx, now blind and broken in the ruins of his own palace, that the deepest meaning of this whole story finally comes into focus. For remember what the riddle of the Sphinx had truly been about. It was about the shape of a single human life, from the 4-legged crawling of an infant, to the 2-legged strength of a grown man, to the 3-legged frailty of an old man leaning on his staff. Oedipus had answered that riddle with perfect clarity for all of mankind, and had utterly failed to see the same riddle written into the shape of his own life, that the infant abandoned on the mountain, and the proud young king who solved the Sphinx, and the blind, broken old man, staggering now through the ruins of his palace, leaning at last upon a staff of his own, were all, from beginning to end, one and the same person, walking a single road he could never once see clearly, even as he saw everything else. Blinded and stripped at last of the crown he had never truly deserved to wear in innocence, Oedipus was cast out from the city he had once saved, exiled from Thebes exactly as the old prophecy had first foretold. Wandering now in darkness, guided in his final years, the old stories tell us, only by the loyal hand of his daughter Antigone, who alone among his household refused to abandon him to his fate. And even in his exile, the curse he had carried was not finished with his family, for his two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, who should have inherited a peaceful kingdom, instead fell into a bitter and consuming rivalry over the throne of Thebes that their father had left behind, a quarrel that would, in the years still to come, lead brother to raise a sword against brother, and bring even greater ruin upon the house of Thebes. The sins of a father, this story insists, again and again, do not end with him. They ripple outward, through every life his choices ever touched. And so we return, at the very end, to the question we began with. Was Oedipus ever truly free? Every single choice he made across his whole life was, in some sense, an act of resistance against his fate. Laius tried to kill his own infant son to defeat the prophecy, and in doing so, sent that son into exile among strangers, setting the whole tragedy in motion. Oedipus, hearing his own doom spoken aloud at Delphi, chose exile from the parents he loved rather than risk harming them, and that very choice carried him, unknowing, onto the road where his true father waited. Every act of resistance, every attempt to outrun what the gods had written, became instead another turn of the same wheel, tightening the very trap each man was so desperately trying to escape. The Greeks did not tell this story to say that human choice means nothing. Every warning Laius and Oedipus each received was, in its own way, a kind of gift, a clear window into the shape their lives would take. And both men, offered that window, chose to spend their whole strength trying to smash it, rather than simply living, with open eyes, inside the life it showed them. They told it, perhaps, to say something stranger and more unsettling still, that fate and choice were never truly opposed at all, that a prophecy is not a chain dragging a man backward, but a description of the very road his own free choices will carve for him, seen from a vantage point outside of time. Oedipus was never a puppet. Every decision was entirely his own. And that is precisely what makes his story so much more terrible and so much more human than a simple curse ever could be. We are not shown a man robbed of his will. We are shown a man exercising his will fully and freely at every single turn, and arriving, by the very force of his own choices, at the one place he had spent his whole life trying desperately not to go. There is, in the end, a strange and quiet mercy hidden inside even this darkest of stories. For the man who blinded himself in horror at what he had failed to see did not remain forever in that first unbearable moment of discovery. In the last chapter of his story, old and blind and wandering, led gently by his daughter's hand into a quiet grove outside the city of Athens, Oedipus is said to have finally found a strange and hard-won peace, as though a lifetime of suffering, honestly faced and fully accepted, at last could earn a soul something like rest. Perhaps that is the last and gentlest truth this old story still has to offer us. that the things fate has already written for us cannot always be outrun, however hard or however far we try to flee them. But how we carry that truth, once it is finally seen clearly and without flinching, in the end remains entirely our own. Rest now. Let the road behind you go quiet and still. Whatever has already been written does not need to be outrun tonight. It only needs at last to be laid down gently and let go.